Hello and welcome to the History Network.org podcast, Season 24, Episode 5, The Battle of Bunker Hill, Part 2. This episode was written by Michael Gaby Gross. Michael received his master's degree in history from the California State University, Sacramento. His thesis project analysed the Phoenix Program, a CIA counterinsurgency operation during the Vietnam War. At the end of Part 1 in the last episode, we got to the beginning of the Siege of Boston, a culmination of the British underestimating the ill feeling of the time, which had been exacerbated by the British mistakenly burning down Concord House, thus igniting a bond and camaraderie between locals, farmers, merchants, and the disenfranchised. British soldiers in Boston were furious. They were pent up in the city by a bunch of farmers and merchants, while their commander seemingly did nothing. April turned to May. The militia forces grew stronger as more companies joined the siege. By now, 4 colonies were represented at Boston: Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, and New Hampshire. Different estimates number the militia force between 10 and 20,000. Those with adequate weapons, ammunition, or combat experience was dramatically less, not to mention the lack of artillery necessary for carrying out a siege. This made the militia's position tenuous, and officers expected a British attack at any moment, but none came. Gage was waiting for long-promised reinforcements. A British division was sailing for Boston, with more promised later. Joining the soldiers were 3 generals who would end up playing huge roles in the coming war. William Howe, widely regarded as one of the best officers of the British Army; Henry Clinton, the unlikable man but bright tactician; and John Burgoyne, the gentleman soldier. Each sought the honour of stamping out this would-be rebellion, and bristled at the thought of working with one another, let alone as subordinates to Gage. As they sailed closer to Boston, the ship carrying the 3 generals hailed a passing ship for news. The captain told them of the fighting in Massachusetts and the siege of Boston, to which Burgoyne boldly proclaimed, "What, 10,000 peasants keeping 5,000 king's troops shut up? Well, let us get in, and we'll soon find elbow room." Each general felt confident they would show both the rebels and Gage a thing or two about fighting. Boston was never completely besieged, as the city could receive constant reinforcements and supplies by sea. There were shortages, but the residents and soldiers were not starving. Moreover, as mentioned, the militia did not have the artillery necessary to truly threaten the British position. But by merely displaying opposition to the British force was an affront to British honour. Gage met with the 3 newly arrived generals to come up with a plan to break the siege. The logical places to secure first were the hills surrounding Boston, Dorchester Heights to the south, and Bunker and Breed's Hill on the Charlestown Peninsula to the north. If the militia fortified those hills with what artillery they could muster, the British Navy in the harbour would be at risk. The British would attack Dorchester Heights and secure the southern flank, then turn around and attack Charlestown. The attack would be June 18th. General Artemus Ward commanded all the colonial militia around Boston, and he received word of impending British attacks. While Ward was positioned in the south, he ordered his second-in-command, Israel Putnam, to reinforce Bunker Hill and prepare to receive the British attack. During the night of June 16th, Colonel William Prescott, a veteran of the French and Indian War, led his Massachusetts militia, without orders, forward to Breed's Hill, where they began digging entrenchments. Clinton, out for a late ride, could hear the digging from across the harbour. Clinton raced to headquarters to urge Gage and Howe to attack at daylight. Meanwhile, one of the ships in the harbour also heard the digging and opened fire, which halted work. British Admiral Samuel Graves ordered a ceasefire, perturbed at being awoken, but Gage countermanded that order. All guns, both on board the ships and those on land, opened fire. Clinton wanted to lead a flanking attack on the enemy rear while the Navy brought floating batteries to fire on the Charlestown Neck, the only avenue of escape for the rebels. Gage, Howe and Burgoyne thought this plan too risky, and instead Howe offered a frontal assault in the grand tradition of European warfare. They would sweep the enemy off the hills and leave them scurrying for their lives. The four generals voted on which plan to follow, to which Clinton later lamented, "My advice was not attended to." Howe would lead the attack, followed by Clinton, while Burgoyne remained in reserve. In fact, Howe had such disdain for the fighting abilities of the militia that he did not even consider the upcoming engagement a fight. To Howe it was more of a demonstration of the power of the British Empire. Meanwhile, Prescott needed more men to reinforce his advanced position. Putnam wanted Prescott to retreat to Bunker Hill, but the militia regiments moved without his orders. Confusion was everywhere. Massachusetts men moved forward to Breed's Hill in support of their kinsmen. Connecticut regiments remained on Bunker Hill with Putnam. New Hampshire regiments were spread across the peninsula. Prescott continued to place his men as the sun rose on the 17th, while he hoped the entrenchments they had been digging through the night were enough to protect them from the inevitable British assault. Across the water, Gage watched Prescott urge his men to dig faster. Beside Gage was loyalist Abijah Willard, Prescott's brother-in-law. When Gage asked Willard if Prescott would fight, Willard responded, "Yes, sir. He is an old soldier and will fight as long as a drop of blood remains in his veins." Hours passed, which gave Prescott and his men valuable time to make last-minute improvements to their fortifications. Sensing a pending attack, Putnam rode to Breed's Hill and ordered Prescott to send the entrenchment tools back to Bunker Hill to avoid their capture. Prescott cautioned that if he sent the men to the rear with the tools, they would not return. Putnam was adamant and assured his colonel his men would return. Prescott relented and sent the tools to the rear. The men did not return. Despite the works on Breed's Hill being incomplete, the British did not attack at first light, as Clinton urged. Gage wanted all his men in position before launching his attack. Likewise, Howe decided to postpone his assault until high tide, meaning the British army would wait until late afternoon. The soldiers were loaded onto barges and waited. Finally, at around 2 p.m, the Navy opened fire. The attack had begun. Cannonballs landed all around Prescott's position on Breed's Hill. Most shots were ineffective, but a few unlucky souls fell victim to the artillery barrage. Historian Richard Ketchum wrote, "A ball came so close to Captain Ebenezer Bancroft that it affected his sight in his left eye, leaving him with partial vision for the rest of his life, and moments later another sheared off Lieutenant Spaulding's head, spattering Prescott with his brains." The artillery barrage did instill fear in the militia huddled around Bunker Hill. Some refused to advance, while others found excuses to retreat further out of range of the British fire. Howe's men landed on the eastern point of the peninsula and marched in full kit, as if on parade, on to Morton's Hill to wait for the second wave of soldiers to cross the harbour and disembark. On his left, Brigadier General Robert Pigott prepared his men for their assault on the redoubt. As they gathered, Pigott's men came under sporadic sniper fire coming from Charlestown. Howe requested assistance in dealing with the snipers from the Navy. Graves ordered his ships to fire on the town. The gunners heated the balls, and soon the town was burning. The fire could be seen from miles away, including in Braintree, Massachusetts, where Abigail Adams took her 7-year-old son John Quincy to the top of a nearby hill to see the smoke of the battle and hear the firing of cannon. Howe saw from his elevated position details of the rebel position. Behind the redoubt on Breed's Hill were more men standing idle, which Howe assumed would soon reinforce Breed's Hill, but he could not know of the confusion behind enemy lines. Colonel John Stark of New Hampshire arrived with his regiment, but he hated Putnam and refused to take orders from the man. Instead, he marched his men forward to support Prescott, who offered Stark the option of placing his men where he saw fit. Stark noticed the left flank of the militia position was unprotected, so he moved his regiment there, extending his line to the beach. There they stood behind a rail fence and a hastily hand-constructed stone wall, which would offer only a fraction of protection from British fire. Joining Prescott on the hill was the 34-year-old Dr. Joseph Warren, one of the leading Patriot figures in Boston, president of the Massachusetts Provincial Congress, and a soon-to-be commissioned Major General in the Massachusetts militia. Warren had been bedridden with migraines throughout the day and early morning, but rose from his bed when he heard the British planned an attack on the Charlestown Peninsula. He travelled to Bunker Hill and met with Putnam, who offered Warren command based on his pending commission. Warren declined the offer as he had limited knowledge on military affairs, instead wishing to fight on this day only as a common soldier. Putnam directed him to the redoubt, where he met with Prescott, who also assumed Warren was there to take command. Warren, with borrowed musket in hand, replied, "No, Colonel, but to give what assistance I can, and to let these damn rascals see that the Yankees will fight." The British finally advanced, but the terrain was not as smooth as they originally believed. The soldiers, loaded down with packs and equipment and sweating in their wool uniforms, made their way unevenly forward. Fences, rocks and holes slowed the advance up the slope of Breed's Hill toward Prescott's line, but Pickett's advance was merely a feint, while Howe's light infantry and grenadiers made the main assault along the bank of the Mystic River. Howe expected this thrust to push through to the rebel flank and take Breed's Hill from the rear. He did not count on John Stark noticing the undefended beach and plugging his New Hampshire regiment directly in the path of the assault. Stark's men let the British come close and stumble over the obstacles they had placed along the beach. Then they opened fire. The volley had a murderous effect on the light infantry. Stark's men levelled their muskets on the rail fence, which offered a stable platform on which to fire. Reverend Peter Thatcher, a Boston minister, reported of the opening assault. The provincials in the redoubt and the lines reserved their fire till the enemy had come within about 10 or 12 yards, and then discharged them at once upon them. The British had very little room to manoeuvre on the beach, and as their officers were among the first to be targeted, they soon were devoid of leadership. As the first ranks melted away, a new line marched forward, only to meet the same fate as the first. The beach was strewn with bodies in scarlet uniforms. The British had no choice but to fall back. Pickett, seeing the main thrust fail, also pulled his men back. The first assault was a devastating failure. The British were not quick to give up. Howe was disheartened at the sight of his men retreating in the face of the rebels. He grew angry at the sound of cheering coming from the enemy lines. Howe reformed his lines and sent them forward again. This time Pickett would lead the main attack against the redoubt, while the diversion would be along the beach against the New Hampshire men. Howe expected Pickett's attack to overwhelm the redoubt and sweep the rebels off the hill. It is at this point that the famous order to "not fire until you see the whites of their eyes" was supposedly uttered, though by whom is a matter of debate. Some credit Prescott, while others say it was Putnam. Still others suggest it was a common phrase that was repeated all down the line. Despite the origin of the phrase, the militiamen once again held their fire until the British were close, and then unleashed a wall of flame. After the first volley came another, then another. One British officer stated, "As we approached, an incessant stream of fire poured from the rebel lines. It seemed a continued sheet of fire for nearly 30 minutes. To the credit of the British soldiers, despite the withering fire and the weight of their equipment, they continued to march up the hill. The attack on the rebel left also made little progress, as Connecticut men under Thomas Knowlton and some of the few cannons in the militia's hands opened fire. This proved to be too much for the diversionary force, and they fell back, leaving Pigot's men to face the enemy alone. Shocked at the tremendous losses he had already suffered, Howe stood alone on the battlefield, his stockings soaked in blood. Howe admitted later, at the sight of his soldiers running for their lives, the light infantry at the same time being repulsed, there was a moment that I never felt before. His men simply could not get close enough to finish their charge. They did fire at the enemy and cause casualties, but they had limited impact on the so far impenetrable militia line. What had once been solid lines of scarlet became jagged, some even non-existent, as the survivors melted back down the hill towards the landing boats. Pigot could do nothing but order retreat. The second assault had failed. Prescott, while his men had thrown back the British a second time, was not in a celebratory mood. In fact, he recognised his men were in a precarious position. Charlestown continued to burn, and although the British were retreating a second time, he knew they would return. What he did not know was how his exhausted men were going to resist a third British assault. Ammunition was running out. Some of the men had nothing left. They gathered what they could from the dead or wounded, but it still was not enough. When they ran out of ammunition and the fighting degraded into hand-to-hand combat, the British would run them through with bayonets. Along with the ammunition shortages, Prescott had a problem of numbers. His men had not gone unscathed, but for each wounded man, several would volunteer to take the wounded to the rear, never to return. The wounded and shirkers did not go far. Most made their way back to Bunker Hill, while others milled around leaderless in the area between the hills, out of range of the British forces. Putnam tried to organise these men into companies and send them back to fight, but most refused. He cajoled, threatened, insulted, and urged, but fear had overtaken them. By this stage of the battle, the number of men on Bunker Hill reached several hundred, but he could not make them move in support of Prescott. Stark was reputed to say later, "Had Putnam done his duty, he would have decided the fate of his country in the first action." Alas, Putnam could not move the men forward, and Prescott's dwindling force remained on their own. Chaos reigned in the British lines. The wounded, lucky enough to find their way back to the boats, were ferried to Boston. The unlucky ones remained where they fell, crying out in pain. Howe, seeing his men decimated and his staff shot down around him, seemed lost. He requested reinforcements. His call was answered by Clinton, who watched the first two failed attacks alongside Burgoyne, who now personally led his men across the water to replace the fallen. Once on the peninsula, Clinton saw the extent of the British losses. The boats in which his men arrived were quickly filled with the wounded and returned to Boston. Clinton conferred with Howe on a plan of action. Once again the British would launch a frontal assault against the redoubt. There would be no flanking attack this time. All the weight of the thrust would be squarely against the redoubt. Clinton also gathered the likely wounded to join his reinforcements in the next attack. Finally, before they set off, the soldiers would have their packs and other unnecessary equipment at the bottom of the hill, marching unencumbered and itching for revenge. The attack began again, this time with Howe in the lead. Distinguished by his figure and gallant bearing, the Navy opened fire again. Ahead of advancing British was the blood-stained grass and the bodies of their comrades, most motionless but some still moving in agony. Once again the militia held their fire until the British came close, as they did not have the ammunition to waste on long-range shots. One colonial soldier said of the British, "As fast as the front man was shot down, the next stepped forward in his place, but our men dropped them so fast they were a long time coming up. It was surprising how they would step over their dead bodies as though they had been logs of wood. This time, despite suffering losses, the British ranks remained intact. The militia fire was less dense than previous assaults, a sign that the militia was almost out of ammunition. The British came closer, and those out of ammunition flipped their muskets around to use as clubs. Others found rocks, nails, and other random projectiles to throw at the enemy. Finally, the British were upon them. They entered the redoubt, and the deadly work of the bayonet began. The British soldiers, infuriated at the previous failures, were without mercy. Prescott used his ceremonial sabre to parry bayonets. Those attempting to surrender were killed. The militia fought their way out of the redoubt, where they discovered more British on their flanks. Clinton had led his men forward to support Howe's left, while other British renewed the assault against Stark's men, forcing them back. Only around 30 of Stark's men remained to prevent the British from cutting off the militia's route of retreat. Reverend Thatcher reported, "The retreat of this handful of brave men would have been effectively cut off had it not have happened that the flanking party, which was to have surrounded the redoubt on the backside, was kept back by a party of provincials who fought with the utmost bravery and kept the British from advancing farther than the beach." Those still in the redoubt made a desperate stand. Dr. Warren, who fought as a common soldier despite his pending commission, fulfilled his wish to die upon my knees in blood. The exhausted British soldiers made only a paltry attempt at pursuing the fleeing rebels, but soon the pursuit was abandoned. They were fought out. Prescott could not hide his contempt for Putnam when he met the general on Bunker Hill. When Prescott questioned the lack of reinforcements, Putnam complained he could not organise the men and send them forward. Prescott would hear none of it. If you could not drive them up, you might have led them up. The two then departed. By this time the militia were retreating off Bunker Hill and attempting to escape the peninsula before the British sealed the only way out. They retreated north and west, some halting to organise a defence under the command of Generals Ward and Putnam, while others continued their flight through the countryside to Cambridge and Medford. The British would not chase them. Their mission was to secure Charlestown Peninsula, and in that they were successful, but at great cost. The British suffered 1,054 killed and wounded, nearly a 50% casualty rate. The militia lost 115 killed and 305 wounded. In a letter to his wife, Gage wrote, "The loss we have sustained is greater than we can bear. I wish this cursed place was burned." Despite the defeat at Bunker Hill and losing control of the Charlestown Peninsula, there was a growing sense in the colonies that this was no ordinary defeat. Lacking training, adequate weapons and ammunition, and in spite of the chaos behind the lines, the colonial militia withstood numerous assaults from the British army and inflicted tremendous casualties. The British would think twice before attacking an entrenched position again. A short time after the battle, with the siege of Boston resumed, the newly centralised and named Continental Army received its first and only Commander-in-Chief, George Washington. Volunteers swelled the ranks of the army, and soon captured artillery from Fort Ticonderoga would arrive to make the British position in Boston untenable. They would soon evacuate Boston and regroup in Nova Scotia. They would return, and in greater numbers, but for now the rebellion could celebrate. Gage's military career was over. He was recalled to London to explain his actions. Gage warned his superiors, "They are now spirited up by a rage and enthusiasm as great as ever people were possessed of, and you must proceed in earnest or give the business up. They must either engage in total war against the colonies or let them have their independence." Gage correctly predicted such half-effort would prolong the war and cost the Empire dearly, but Gage's pessimism was ignored. In his place, the victor of Bunker Hill, William Howe, was elevated to overall command. This was to prove a poor choice. Howe was never the same after Bunker Hill. He refused to launch frontal attacks against well-defended lines, even when there was a chance to finally destroy the rebellion. For those still eager for reconciliation between Great Britain and her colonies, the Battle of Bunker Hill marked the end of such hopes. Too much blood was spilled to simply forgive and forget. Indeed, 1 year after the battle, in July 1776, the colonies made it official and declared their independence from the British Empire. There was no turning back. This war would either lead the birth of a new nation or complete subjugation to the wills of King George III and the British Parliament. Battles across the 13 former colonies would be fought to decide this fate. Of the battle, Abigail Adams would write to her husband John, who was a member of the Continental Congress in Philadelphia, "The day, perhaps the decisive day, has come on which the fate of America depends." She would soon learn just how prophetic her words would be. Thanks for listening. You've been listening to the HistoryNetwork.org podcast, written by Michael Gaby Gross, read by Nick Barker.